The next morning, as the first rays of light pierced the dense forest, I was awakened by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching my camp. It was a messenger from the Winterpelt clan, his face etched with worry. He brought news that would thrust the already tense situation into a full-blown crisis. Hildi, Einar's daughter, had been found dead, her body lying just within the territory of the Timberfang, her throat ripped out. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I had just met Hildi the day before. She had been introduced to me by her father during our meeting. Einar had been clear about his intentions to protect his clan and his family at all costs. The implications of Hildi's death were grave. Adding to the gravity of the situation was a piece of evidence that the messenger relayed to me. A bloody tuft of gray fur had been found clutched in Hildi's mouth, her wolf form's jaws still locked around it even in death. A clear indicator that a Timberfang werewolf was involved in her death. The moment I received the news of Hildi's death, I knew that I had to act swiftly. Einar was a man driven by a fierce sense of duty to protect his clan and family. I was certain that this tragedy would push him to the brink, potentially igniting the spark that would lead to an all-out war. With a sense of foreboding, I made my way to the Winterpelt's encampment to speak with Einar. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was tense, almost palpable. Einar was in the midst of rallying his clan for an attack on the Timberfangs, his eyes ablaze with a mix of grief and fury. The clan members, too, a boiling pot of rage, ready to erupt at any moment. As Einar caught sight of me, his expression hardened. "Alistair," he greeted coldly, "I trust you have heard." I nodded solemnly. "I have, Einar. It's a tragedy. I cannot begin to imagine the pain you must be feeling." Einar's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions. Pain, yes, but also rage. "They took my daughter from me, Alistair. I cannot. I will not let that stand." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I understand your desire for retribution, Einar, but we must consider the consequences. If you attack now, without definitive proof, it could lead to a war that neither side can afford." Einar's eyes flared with anger. "Definitive proof? Timberfang fur in my daughter's mouth isn't definitive enough for you?" "It is damning evidence, certainly," I conceded, my mind racing as I tried to piece everything together. The Timberfangs didn't seem like the sort to resort to this kind of action. I couldn't imagine their clan resorting to outright murder, especially of a child. But we must be absolutely certain. If we act in haste, it could lead to unnecessary bloodshed. Let me conduct a thorough investigation. If it is indeed the Timberfangs who are responsible, then they will pay. But we must be sure. Einar's eyes flamed with anger, and he stood abruptly. "You ask for patience when my daughter lies cold and lifeless. And you speak of uncertainty when the evidence points directly to the Timberfangs." I understood his rage, his pain. It was a father's right to avenge his child. But I also knew the cost of war, the toll it would take on both clans. A compromise was needed, a sign of goodwill. I reached down to my side and unbuckled my runic sword from my belt, holding it out to Einar. "This sword," I said, feeling the familiar weight of the blade in my hands, "is not just a weapon, but a companion that has stood by my side through countless battles. Forged with ancient magic, it is the only thing that has kept me alive in a world teeming with creatures that would see me dead. To part with it, even temporarily, leaves me vulnerable. Yet, I entrust it to you, Einar, as a tangible symbol of my dedication to uncovering the truth behind your daughter's murder. If I fail in my task, or do not return, Consider it yours to keep." Einar's eyes flicked from my face to the sword and back again. He seemed to be weighing his options, the gravity of the situation heavy on his shoulders. Finally, he reached out and took the sword from my hands. "We will hold back, temporarily," he said gruffly. "But be quick about it, Alistair. My daughter deserves justice, and I intend to see that she gets it." I nodded. "Thank you, Einar. I will not let you down." As I left the Winterpelt encampment, the reality of the situation hit me full force. The road ahead would be treacherous, but I was determined to see it through. The fate of many rested on my shoulders, and I could not afford to fail. My investigation commenced under the reluctant guidance of a young wolf from the Winterpelt clan. The youth, no more than a pup, really, led me to the border river that marked the edge of the territories of the two clans. There, he paused, a mournful howl escaping his lips as he gestured with his snout towards a red stain in the snow near the river. The spot was within Winterpelt territory. The sadness emanating from the young werewolf was almost palpable, a heavy weight that seemed to meld with the cold, damp air around us. The location of Hildy's demise was chilling, not just because of the freezing temperatures. A haunting pool of dried blood stained the pristine snow, a stark contrast to the surrounding whiteness. The location was profoundly somber, lying halfway between the border river that divided the territories and the forest that marked the Winterpelt hunting grounds and potential safety. Scattered around the blood were various sets of tracks, all originating from the direction of the Winterpelt forest. One set, smaller and lighter, I identified as Hildy's. The others were more ambiguous, larger, heavier prints that could belong to any number of wolves or humans from the Winterpelt clan who found her body or, more sinisterly, were involved in her demise. My eyes darted across the scene, trying to discern any pattern or anomaly that might offer a clue, but the snow masked all but the most obvious details. This was strange in its own right. There were no footsteps or paw prints to be found on the Timberfang side for a considerable distance around the location. Despite the recent snowfall, it shouldn't have been enough to completely obscure any tracks. This puzzling observation gnawed at my mind as I made my way to the Timberfang clan. The biting cold nipped at my face as I made my way through the Timberfang territory, treading carefully over the icy terrain that seemed almost sentient in its treacherousness. The Timberfang clan had always been wary of outsiders, but now, with the air thick with accusations and distrust, their suspicion was heightened tenfold. On my arrival, Harkin, the head of the clan, met me with a gaze as steely as the frozen ground beneath our feet. He allowed me to speak, a slight nod of his head the only indication that I had permission to continue. "Harkin," I began, my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, "I am here to investigate the death of Hildy, daughter of Einar. I ask for your cooperation and that of your clan in this investigation." I started with Harkin as a sign of respect for his leadership. His eyes, a stormy gray that mirrored the turbulent sky above us, watched me closely as I explained the gravity of the situation and the evidence found at the scene of the crime, a tuft of gray fur clutched in Hildy's mouth. Harkin's reaction was immediate and visceral. His eyes darkened, and his lips curled back in a snarl. "This is a farce," he spat, the words a venomous hiss that cut through the icy air. "A Winterpelt plot to wage war. We have done nothing wrong." I held up a hand, a gesture meant to pacify. "I am here to uncover the truth, Harkin. Nothing more, nothing less." I gestured to the members of his clan, who had gathered around us, drawn by the intensity of our exchange. May I? Harkin's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, anger, suspicion, resignation before he nodded curtly. Proceed, he said, the word a grudging concession. I approached the first member of the clan, a robust female with a thick coat of fur that shimmered like quicksilver in the dappled sunlight. I explained what I was looking for, and, after a moment's hesitation, she allowed me to examine her fur. It was a meticulous process, one that required a keen eye and a steady hand. As I moved from one member to the next, Harkin watched me like a hawk, his gaze sharp and unyielding. It wasn't until I reached a young male with a nervous twitch in his eye that I found what I was looking for, a patch of fur on his flank that looked as if it had been ripped out. The fur found in Hildy's mouth was a perfect match. I turned to Harkin, who was watching me with a mix of hope and trepidation. This tuft of missing fur, I said, gesturing to the young male. Can you explain this? The young wolf seemed taken aback by the accusation, his eyes widening in shock. He stammered for a moment before regaining his composure. I didn't do this, he said, shaking his head vigorously. I swear on my life. He looked at Harkin, desperation in his eyes. I was attacked by something. I don't know what it was. It was dark, and it moved so fast. Harkin's gaze was stern, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Is this true? He asked, looking around at the other clan members. None of them seemed to know what to say, exchanging uncertain glances with one another. The young wolf nodded hesitantly, his eyes downcast. Yes, he muttered, almost inaudibly. Harkin sighed heavily, running a paw through his fur. Why didn't you come to me with this? He asked, his voice tinged with both concern and frustration. The young wolf looked up, meeting Harkin's gaze with a mix of guilt and defiance. Because I knew how it would look, he said. And I didn't want to be the reason for more bloodshed. The air was thick with tension as everyone absorbed the young wolf's words. It was clear that he was telling the truth. Harkin seemed to understand this as well, as he nodded slowly. I turned my attention back to the young wolf. Can you tell me more about the attack? Did you see who or what attacked you? The young wolf shook his head, clearly frustrated. It was dark, and it happened so fast. I was tracking an odd scent. I thought it was a member of the Winterpelt, when out of nowhere it lunged at me from the shadows. I managed to avoid it, but it tore off some of my fur. Then it just took off into the air and flew away. Flew away? I pondered. While there were many creatures in these parts that could fly, there were none that would be bold enough to attack a werewolf, even a young one. Yes, the wolf nodded, his eyes wide with fear as he recalled the encounter. I've never seen anything move so fast. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. I frowned, deep in thought. This was a new development, and one that I would need to consider carefully. Whatever had attacked the young wolf was likely the same creature responsible for Hildy's death. And if it could fly, that made it all the more dangerous. Thank you, I said, placing a reassuring hand on the young wolf's shoulder. You've been very helpful. The wolf nodded, though he didn't look particularly reassured. Alistair couldn't blame him. The situation was far from resolved, and until it was, no one was safe. With a final nod to Harkin, I left the Timberfang camp and headed back into the forest. I had a lot to think about, and not much time to do it. The clock was ticking, and with each passing moment, the threat of war loomed ever larger. As I left the camp, my highly tuned senses spotted a flicker in my peripheral vision, a dark shadow lurking in a nearby tree. Suspicious, I made a conscious effort to avoid looking directly at it, and instead started to make my way back to my camp. I focused intensely on my surroundings as I walked, actively using my hearing to keep track of the creature's location. I heard what sounded like a small winged creature following me from a distance, the flapping of its tiny wings just barely audible on the edge of my hearing. It followed me, occasionally landing on trees with a soft thud that I could just barely make out, continuing its flight when I reached a far enough distance away. I stopped and slowly looked around, my senses heightened, and spotted the dark spot in a nearby tree again, a bat. My mind was racing. A bat in this region, during this time of day, was highly unusual. My mind raced as I considered the implications. Bats were not common in this area, and their appearance now could only mean one thing. As I stood there, the gears in my mind began to turn rapidly. Vampire. The thought bubbled to the surface, almost involuntarily. It was common knowledge among those in the supernatural community that vampires had the ability to transform into bats. However, the skill level required for such transformations varied greatly. Most vampires transformed into swarms of bats, which was a simpler transformation as it allowed them to maintain the same total weight. The physics of magic, after all, usually adhered to some basic principles of conservation. But transforming into a single bat, that was a different story altogether. It was a feat that required a massive reduction in mass, something that was far more difficult to achieve for a vampire. This indicated not just any vampire, but one who was highly skilled and powerful, one that the standard rules did not apply to. And if that was the case, then the stakes of this investigation had just risen exponentially. I steadied my breath, feeling the pulse of adrenaline in my veins as the bat flew towards me. A clear indication that it was done with the subterfuge. In a split second, the bat transformed in midair, morphing into the form of a vampire before lunging at me with supernatural speed. Instinctively, my hand went to my side, reaching for the familiar hilt of my sword, only to grasp at empty air. A wave of momentary panic washed over me as I remembered my deal with Einar and the absence of my most prized possession. Without a moment to lose, I sidestepped the vampire's lunge, narrowly avoiding its outstretched claws. It snarled in frustration, its fangs glistening in the fading light. I quickly sized up my opponent, pale skin over lean muscles, red eyes that seemed to absorb the light, and a predatory grace that spoke of centuries of existence. I had to rely on my other skills now. I dodged another swipe, moving fluidly to avoid the creature's attacks. Each move was calculated, each step designed to keep me out of reach while I searched for an opening. The vampire was fast, but I had faced their kind before, and I knew their tactics. I feinted to the left, then pivoted and landed a solid punch to its jaw. The vampire stumbled back, momentarily stunned, and I seized the opportunity to press my advantage. As I prepared to land another strike, my eyes met the creature's, and I faltered. Recognition dawned on me. The face before me was one I knew, one I had seen before, encountered years ago in London. A face that had once wreaked havoc on the city, and one I was certain I had eradicated from this world. As the vampire regained its composure, a sinister smile spread across its face, its eyes alight with malicious glee. It had noticed my moment of realization. How? I began, my voice a mixture of disbelief and confusion. The vampire laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. You thought a simple stab to the heart would be enough to kill me? It sneered. You cannot defeat me. I am eternal. The arrogance in its voice was infuriating, but I couldn't help the nagging doubt that crept into my mind. Had I underestimated this creature? And what did it mean for this fight? If a sword to the heart hadn't been enough to kill it, then what would be? I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. This vampire was dangerous, and I needed to stay sharp if I was going to survive this encounter. I took the opportunity to study the vampire more closely. My eyes were drawn to its attire, a large fur coat. It looked familiar. Wolf fur? No, werewolf fur. Could this be how the vampire had managed to move within the clan territories undetected? By masking its own scent with the fur of a werewolf, each clan would assume it was a member of the other clan. Between its scent being similar to a werewolf and its ability to turn into a single bat, it could navigate between the territories with little issue. Could this vampire be the mastermind behind the entire situation? My mind raced as I pieced together the puzzle. The vampire standing before me, gloating in its perceived victory, might just be the catalyst for a war that could destroy everything I had worked to build. It was clear now that this was about more than just survival. I had to put an end to this creature's schemes before it was too late. Pushing aside the wave of exhaustion that threatened to overtake me, I gathered my remaining strength and prepared for another round of battle. This vampire might be powerful, but I was determined to stop it at all costs. The vampire surged towards me with a burst of energy, its movements a dance of deadly grace. It was painfully clear that the creature regarded me as nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a sentiment that only grew more pronounced as the battle wore on. Bereft of my sword, I found myself at a significant disadvantage, a fact that the vampire seized upon with malicious delight. It taunted me without respite, nimbly evading my strikes while landing its own with brutal precision. "Do you honestly believe you stand a chance, Alistair?" It sneered, its voice dripping with contempt. "You're practically defenseless, a lamb to the slaughter." Each jeering remark cut deep, fueling my determination, yet simultaneously sapping my strength. The vampire's mocking laughter echoed in my ears as I struggled to maintain my composure. It was rapidly becoming apparent that my efforts were in vain. The vampire was in control, and it relished every moment. "You're inept without your weapon," it mocked, eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. "Perhaps you should simply resign yourself to being a spectator as I tear asunder the tenuous peace between these pathetic clans." The battle wore on, and with each passing moment, my energy ebbed away. The hits I managed to land seemed inconsequential, merely fueling the vampire's scornful laughter. My stamina was dwindling at an alarming rate, and the vampire knew it. I came to this fight unprepared and weaponless, and it was only a matter of time before I would be rendered defenseless. A sense of desperation clawed at my innards as I frantically searched for a way to turn the tide of the battle. I needed to change the trajectory of the fight, and fast. With a sudden, powerful move, the vampire knocked me to the ground, standing over me with a triumphant sneer. As I lay on the ground, I decided to take a gamble. Feigning greater injury than I actually had, I goaded the vampire in a bid to extract more information about its intentions. "Is that all you've got?" I wheezed, mustering as much disdain as I could muster. "I thought you had grander plans than just killing a defenseless man." The vampire's eyes sparkled wickedly, a dance of amusement and malevolence that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, I have plans, dear Alistair," it purred, savoring each word as though it were a delicious morsel. "These pitiful werewolf clans, they'll tear each other apart, limb from limb. And once they've all but eradicated each other, my kin and I will graciously swoop in to finish off the job. This land, this wild, untamed expanse, will become a new stronghold for my kind." It's the perfect location to expand our territory, a bastion of our newfound strength. The vampire's voice dripped with a sickening sweetness that belied the cruelty of its intentions. And why this land? I prodded. What's so special about it? A wicked smile spread across the vampire's face. Because it's something you care about, Alistair, it said, almost sweetly. And it gives me great pleasure to take away something you hold dear and reducing it to ashes. Clenching my teeth, I forced myself to stand up, adopting a defensive stance as the vampire prepared for another assault. How I wished for my sword at that moment, or any weapon for that matter. But I had left my silvered weapons behind as a sign of good faith to the werewolves. A decision I was now regretting deeply. With a snarl, the vampire lunged at me, its razor-sharp claws aimed directly at my chest. I narrowly dodged the swipe, feeling the wind from its passage brush against my skin. Spinning around, I aimed a punch at its face, but it easily ducked, counterattacking with a kick that sent me sprawling to the ground. Before I could recover, it was upon me, pinning me down with its superior strength. Suddenly, the chilling sound of howls filled the air, emanating from multiple directions and resonating through the dense forest. The vampire's head snapped in every direction, its piercing eyes scanning the dark woods even as it continued its advance towards me. It was evident that it recognized the ominous sound for what it was, the approach of reinforcements. Although they were not yet visible, their presence was undeniably near. Seizing the opportunity to inflict one final mental wound, the vampire smirked malevolently. "You should know," it hissed venomously. The young Winterpelt pup met a most pathetic end. She barely had time to register my presence before I tore her throat out. She collapsed onto the snow, whimpering in agony, pathetically powerless to resist. I pried her little mouth open as she struggled for breath and jammed the fur, plucked from another wolf just hours earlier, down her throat. She choked on it as the life drained from her eyes. Her pitiful, insignificant life will be a sacrifice that will ultimately prove instrumental in purging this land of the werewolf vermin. With a final sneer, the vampire transformed into its bat form and soared into the night sky, leaving me laying there, a maelstrom of rage and helplessness swirling within me. I used every ounce of strength I had left to struggle to my feet. In the distance, I spotted Harkin and some of his clan members, their colors barely visible through the trees. Relief washed over me as I staggered towards them, my body trembling from the exertion of the fight. Every step was a battle, my legs feeling as though they were made of lead. I willed myself to keep moving, knowing that I had to reach them, had to warn them about the vampire's plan. But as I stumbled forward, the adrenaline that had been fueling me through the fight began to wear off. As the wolves got close, I could feel myself succumbing to the exhaustion that had been steadily building. My vision blurred, my legs gave out beneath me, and the world went dark as I collapsed onto the snowy floor, unconscious